Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host, Bryan. We're going to wrap up this 2-week theme, exploring covers, looking at an original track, and then comparing it to a cover of that song with some pain. Both the band name and the general themes explored in the original, at least. The song is Eleanor Rigby, and yesterday we checked out the Beatles' original version of this song, which was an interesting mix for me. I've never heard the Beatles really do something that melancholic, and I've never heard the Beatles do Baroque pop either. It'll be interesting to see where Pain takes this song, something that I think, well, given their band name, they might be able to extrapolate emotionally. I also see that this song is almost twice as long. The original was just over 2 minutes, and this one is almost 4. Let's dive in and see what Pain is bringing to the table today. So that string section sounds very close to the original one.
Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where the wedding has been. Lives in the dream, waits at the window, wearing the face that she keeps in the job at the door. Who is it for? All the lonely people. Where do they all come from? All the lonely people. Where do they all belong? Ah, look at all the lonely people. Ah, look at all the lonely people. Father Mackenzie writing the word of a sermon, but no one will hear. No one comes here. Look at him working, carrying his socks in the night when there's nobody there. What does he care? All the lonely people. Where do they all come from? All the lonely people.
It's interesting listening to the sections that definitely come from the original and how this new instrumentation might recontextualize some of those, well, in this case, mostly harmonic ideas.
Eleanor Rigby died in the church and was buried along with the name. Nobody came. Father Mackenzie wiping the dust from his hand as he walked from the grave. No one was safe. All the lonely people. Where do they all come from?
I'm gonna have to look that up. I might go listen to the original real quick sometime in this video.
Ah, look at all the lonely people.
The verse is in 5-bar phrases. I don't recall that at all in the Beatles version.
Look at all the lonely people. Look at all the lonely people. Look at all the people. Look at all the
You know what's interesting is the first thing I thought is, dang, a 30-second fade out. That's half of a minute. That's, an eighth of the song right there. But I honestly don't think it's that long. It makes me think about tracks that I've listened to hundreds of times, some of my favorite ones that happen to fade out. And yeah, I guess 30 seconds is about normal. But when you think about it as a percentage of the song, it feels like a huge chunk. Yeah, so this track, it takes the core elements of the original. And so we do have that we have that moving string part that we hear at the beginning of the song and consistently throughout. We have that constant eighth note attack going on in this track that we heard on the strings on the Beatles' original one. This one's done with guitars and possibly synth, though. It creates this big sort of industrial metal sounds, just this pounding rather than these short, sharp attacks that we got from the strings originally. It's this massive sound that takes up so much space. It doesn't feel like something cutting, it feels like something pounding now. And we have the melody on the vocals. Everything else in the original has been discarded. I mentioned yesterday that there's a lot of nuance to this. The concept of theme and variation, the first verse being fairly straightforward, but the second and third verses having variation in them, with the violins playing alongside the vocal part, either as texture layering or counterpoint or column response. There's various ways that melodies get worked into it. All of that has been tossed out the window here. There's also the beautiful movement at the beginning of the Beatles version where the strings have these long legato ideas and they're interconnected and playing around each other and creating this swirling harmonic idea. That's also been discarded. We do have the vocal harmonies here still, but they're digitized. I don't know if they are multiple takes or if it's, sung at once and then formant shifted and pitch shifted them in order to create the additional layers. They all sound like the same vocalist though, which presents a very different idea than having multiple vocalists, since you don't have texture combinations being put in there as well. It's just harmonic movement, which is generally fine. I understand most bands don't have access to multiple vocalists, and that's the reason why we typically have multiple takes done or using production to create richer vocal harmonies out of just one take. I get it. And maybe Pain only has one vocalist, but I do feel like that's another element that's sort of missing, which I completely glossed over. I wish I had brought this up yesterday. The concept of a song about lonely people sung by a group of people singing together, there's a bit of irony there. That I kind of find interesting in retrospect. A group of people, 3 people in particular, coming all together to sing in vicinity of each other. Look at all the lonely people. Just the division between this group of friends making art together, doing stuff together, talking about people who have no one in their life. We don't get that here, though. We have somebody harmonizing with themselves. They have no one else to sing with. I think that brings an interesting element to the track. It also doesn't put the vocals front and center. You can't miss it. In fact, the vocals coming in on beat 1 of the Beatles version was something that I mentioned yesterday, was such an ear-catching element. Besides just the strings, you have their beautiful, as always, vocal harmonies. Here you don't, though. The harmonies are there, but they're sort of pressed down. You have your lead vocal center in the mix, in the limelight, but the other layers to the harmony are pushed down into the mix. They're there, but they're not on the same level. They are almost part of the atmosphere more than a group, a joint experience in the spotlight. That's interesting too. I think that this song particularly paints a much stronger element of loneliness. a lot of this song feels very singular, whereas, the Beatles was very much a group effort. They weren't playing the strings, I don't think. Probably had session musicians for those, and it was a group of people singing, friends, co-workers. I actually don't know the relationship between the Beatles. I know that it kind of hasn't been great post. They've kind of gone their separate ways, but I like to assume that at one point they were probably friends. Um, but this just feels like one person. In fact, given the digitization of a lot of this, um, it wouldn't surprise me if this is a solo artist. I actually don't know anything about Payne, and if y'all have told me, then apparently I've forgotten. But if y'all told me this was a solo artist, I'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. The drums feel digitized. The guitar, I mean, it's a guitar sound, but it's also accompanied by a lot of digital synthesizer work too to support that sound. So maybe even the guitar is digital. And all the vocal lines in this are, as far as I can tell, the same person. So there's definitely more of a lonely component to the sonic element here. But aside from the differences, and particularly, I think the simplification of this song to put it into this industrial metal sound, there's also the heavier weight. The other one was very light. It was a bunch of strings playing staccato notes. It felt light and bouncy. This takes a lot of that. And like I said, it's no longer a cutting sound, it's a pounding. This is a weight. These instruments are massive. They put a lot of force down on the listener. This is something that feels like you're constantly being beaten down. It also presents a darker tone overall. Rather than having these rich string instruments, we have these rather aggressive distorted guitars and distorted electronic tones, which feel angsty. While the melodic line hasn't changed at all, and while the chord progression hasn't changed at all and still carries some of that, a little bit of brightness to it, you can't help but feel that the darkness in this is being presented more than it was in the original. The original had a little bit of balance, but still just enough sorrow in it for me to call that out when we checked it out yesterday. But here it feels like the main attraction. When the vocals aren't singing, when we don't have that main melodic element, this just feels like crushing, sorrowful weight. It really leans into that side of lonely people and actually recontextualizes some of the stuff. And I think that's one of the cool things about this track is not so much of what it does in isolation. I think that the Beatles version is my favorite of the two, given its stronger composition. But this one makes me see the Beatles version in a different light. And right off the bat, I didn't even make the connection about a group of people singing about lonely people, but also look at the lyrics. The narrator isn't lonely, or the narrators in the Beatles version. It says, look at the lonely people. Look at them. There's a separation, a distinction between the two. It's almost as if someone with friends is saying, hey, dude, look at that person. He's so lonely over there. Just picking up rice after someone else's wedding. Doesn't even they're not even known in their community. Look at them. They're so lonely. There, I think, is an attempt at sympathy in the song. But compared to this feels heavily sympathetic because it almost seems like the song is being sung by a lonely person. And that's a perspective we don't get from the Beatles version. And comparing the two, it makes the Beatles version feel less compassionate in hindsight. I'm not saying that component is there. I'm not saying that song was written by them as a way of poking fun at people who have less, people in their lives. But in comparison to this one highly exaggerates a sympathetic read to it. And by contrast, the Beatles looks less sympathetic. And I find that to be a really interesting thing because this is the second time this week that's happened. where the cover has caused me to view the original in a different manner. Because by contrast, the cover does something the original doesn't. I find that to be a really interesting part of this one. I do wonder how the time comes into play here. Granted, like I said, the last 30 seconds are a fade out that we don't get on the Beatles version, but that still gives us about a minute and 15 seconds extra on this one. Where did that come from? The tempo feels about right. It's still just verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, done. That doesn't really change much. There is a little bridge in there. I don't understand how this song is so much longer. I'd be curious if anyone else has something. I mean, it's got to be, there's got to be a section in here. Maybe one of the instrumental parts. Maybe there's more space between the verses and choruses. And it just adds up over time, having this, extra 10 seconds, maybe an extra 4-bar loop that the Beatles don't have between sections, and that just adds up over time. But I was really surprised knowing that this one was so much longer, only to find that it felt just as short as the Beatles version. It doesn't really feel any different either. Tempo-wise, structure-wise, pacing-wise. So that's interesting. The other thing, though, I found the verses to be a little awkward. And it wasn't until the third verse when I was like, all right, let's figure this out. Why does this feel awkward? Did the original feel awkward? I don't think so. This never came up there. It's a 5-bar verse. And the emphasized first syllable of each sentence, each line in the stanza, sometimes comes in at inopportune times. It makes the rhythm feel a bit jagged and unexpected. When I break, well, I'm not going to break to read lyrics because I already know the lyrics, but I'm going to take a break after this section to go back and listen to the Beatles version of it. I don't remember any sort of interesting or unusual phrasing happening in the verse. It all felt like 4 bars of 4/4 to me. So if that is true, and this changed that to make something a little bit more jagged with its rhythmic device, that would be an interesting element added to this song. You know what? Before I get into it, let me go check that out. Okay, this is bizarre. I can't believe I didn't pick up on this yesterday. The verses are 10-bar verses, broken up into 2 groups of 5. There is a 4-bar phrase, which kind of states the whole thing for the first verse. It's Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been. There's 4 bars. Lives in a dream, that's the 5th bar. It kind of comes in on its own. There's a pause before it. But what's interesting is that lives in a dream, waits at the window. It moves right into the next pack of 5. It almost feels like it should be a 6-bar phrase. The break after the main sentence, the shorter sentence, a break, and then moving into the next half of the stanza. And that's what felt odd about Payne's version, moving from lives in a dream to waits in the window, the last line of the first half into the first line of the second half. It doesn't feel like it should naturally move there. It feels like we need another break because we're working with odd numbers of bars here. It creates a bit of a rough transition as far as accent pattern goes, because you have lives in a window, lives in a dream, waits in a window, and it just kind of comes in a little earlier than you expect with another hard hit, because picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been. That has a nice rhythmic flow to it. This becomes choppy though. And listening back to the Beatles one, it's not quite as accentuated. Part of that is probably due to the sounds of the time, but I think a lot of it is also due to context. And now, having heard the Payne version and jumping back and forth between the two quickly, the Payne version is very articulated. It's very hard-hitting, very sharp. A lot of this has to do with the industrial metal side of things. But what it does is take this already slightly off rhythmic idea and this choppiness between halves, and really leans into it, really hammers it home. And I think that's what brought it to my attention. I'm not going to say that it's completely invisible on the Beatles version. Now that I know it's there, I'm honestly wondering how I missed it, but I think they smoothed over it nicely enough. But with the Pain version, it is, I'm going to put this down. It is in your face. You can't miss it. You can't ignore it. And that brings a whole new thing to the equation. A feeling of being incomplete. It really feels like we're jumping the gun there. These should be 12 bar verses, not 10. We need that break between the two halves to help with flow, to help with pacing. It feels rushed because of that. It feels incomplete. There's something missing. And for these lonely people, a social life is what's missing. They're lonely. They want something more in their lives, and they're not getting it. I'm glad that Pain brought that to my attention. And I wish somehow I could retroactively apply this to the last video, because I really think it's a key element of the song. Unfortunately, you can't edit YouTube videos once they've been posted. But maybe I'll leave a pinned comment on that one, because this is a huge element, I think, in understanding this song and having the music tie into the lyrical themes. Cool. Otherwise, I don't have much else to add to this. Like I said, they basically took the core elements of the original, stripped off most of the elements that were smaller, more minute, or added to it. We basically just kept the riff and the chord progression and the melody, and that's it. And to me, I do find that the extra parts, the flourish that Beatles put on theirs, is something I enjoyed more than this one. And I'm kind of upset that Pain removed it in order to create this more simplified idea. But I do understand how that works better within their sound and what they were going for, and this emphasis of weight over the dexterity that some of those additional melodic ideas brought to the table. Also, I want to talk about this real quick. The idea of call and response, counterpoint, texture layering is all about two things working together to make something sound cooler. And in the idea of lonely people, I just realized that so much of the Beatles version is two or more things coming together and working together that lonely people would not be able to do. So stripping a lot of that off and going for a singularity in the atmosphere, in the writing, in the melodic components for a song about lonely people makes a lot of sense. And I think Pain did a great job at trying to strip back some of those elements. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but at least that's the read I get on this. It's less interesting of a composition, but more thematically appropriate, I think. And that just really adds to the sympathetic angle that I think Pain puts on these lyrics. Yeah, I'm happy with this. You know, getting through the song, I was like, geez, you know, they took the baseline elements, you know, what you would need to recognize the song, and got rid of all the flourish. But I think in the long run, that was a smart decision to do. Less interesting of a composition, but like I said, more thematically appropriate. And I was a little worried I was going to come off of this one a bit disheartened with this cover as a lesser than, but I think it actually ends up holding its own and saying, look, this is a valid interpretation of this track. And I'm glad we got to the end of this, because I was not in the same frame of mind when the track was over. And it only took talking through it for me to begin to appreciate what Pain was doing here. These are my thoughts on Pain's cover of Eleanor Rigby. What did you think of this song? What do you think of it as a comparison to the Beatles' original? Is there anything in here that you enjoyed, something you didn't like as much? Is there something you'd like to add on to what I said or correct me on? Do you have your own interpretation of all of this? Please put all of that and any other thoughts you might have into the comment section. Above that, in the description box, is a link for Linktree. It'll take you here, which has links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell, I greatly appreciate all three of those. That wraps it up for today. I'll be back tomorrow, though, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 p.m. UTC as usual. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.